What do you think? Should I start?
Get the whips out.
Okay. Well, I'd like to, yes, I think we're officially...
Do you want me to whistle for everybody?
Yeah, whistle. Hey, can you whistle? She could whistle.
Hey, Tom.
Yay! Welcome to Creekside Explorer. Is this officially the first one of this season? I think it is. Anyway, thank you for your interest in this. This is about twice as many people, frankly, as I expected. So, hey, that's good. We'll see if any of you come back next week. Although the good news is there's a few people actually who couldn't make it this week who are coming next week. So hopefully you're in the right class. How can Christians think about science? I initially didn't like that title, and then I decided it's a good thing because it's actually kind of ambiguous. Because it's how can Christians think about science? How can Christians think about science? How can Christians think about science? Or how can Christians think about science? So it all depends on where you're coming from as to which of those words you like to emphasize. Well, let's start with some administrative details in a second, and I'll run over sort of some of the class schedule things. Some people are like, oh, I have so many questions, when should I ask them? Well, you'll have some sort of idea as we go along here. So why don't we start out with a little word of prayer, or maybe a big word of prayer in this case, and we'll take it from there. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for getting all of us here safely and in one piece, and with our brains ready to go, and hopefully our hearts to follow along also, and our affections and even our behavior. We thank you, Lord, that your goal for us is always to conform us to the image of your Son. And whatever you think about Jesus, you knew he was a smart guy. And we thank you that you call us to follow after him to the best of our abilities, and as you gift us with that. Thank you for all the growth you just caused in me as I look over this last few months getting this whole thing together. And I thank you for the opportunity to hopefully drag some people along with me, willingly or not. And I pray that you would help us to be listening to each other, charitable when necessary and challenging when necessary, and that you would watch over our fellowship and the technology and just everything that comes together here, and that by the end of this class we could be just a little bit more like your Son. And we ask all this in his name. Amen. Just a couple of minor details to start with. This is officially 5 weeks, but each week is somewhat self-contained. A few people are like, oh, I can't make it to the first, but I'll be there in the others, or I'll be there for the first, third, and fifth, or whatever. That's fine. The other thing to let people know, if somebody's like, well, I can't make it to the first one, so I just didn't bother to show up at all, you can let those people know that you're not going to miss anything today that's going to make it impenetrable for the next 4 weeks. So they don't even officially have to sign up. I know we prefer that you do, but that's fine either way. A lot of you received, when you signed up, you got this little sort of survey thing of some, asking about you and asking things that you want to discuss and things you didn't want to discuss. And that follows up on just casual conversations I had with people even months ago. And I'd say whenever I'd go up to anybody and say, oh, I'm talking about Christianity and science, I'd say about half the people that I talked to just in the atrium after service, like, oh, so you're going to be talking about evolution and creation? Yes, sure. That's about a third of our 4th week. Interestingly enough, in the little survey I got back, 2 people said, please don't discuss that. Now, they didn't go into detail as to why that was true. My hunch is it's for one of 2 reasons. Either they think it's been beat to death. It's like, I've heard so much about this, and please, we don't need to go over this one more time. I've made up my mind. I know what the deal is. I've heard every argument in every possible direction. We don't need to discuss that anymore. I empathize with that. The other reason why I think possibly is because that's arguably the most contentious issue for Christians and science. And as we'll discuss both today and in week 3, it's kind of disappointing that it is that way, because I think that's a bit of a molehill in my opinion. I was reading just this morning about the Battle of Castanets. Don't quote me on that. It was during the Austrian-Turkish War of 1798. You all know all about that, I'm sure. Never heard of it. But it has the distinction of being the most horrible friendly fire incident in military history. This is back before machine guns were even invented. It's two Austrian forces thought the other group was a Turkish force and spent 3 days fighting with each other. There were over 1,500 casualties. And sometimes, unfortunately, Christian debates can be a little bit like that. We're shooting at each other, and the Turks, meanwhile, are just watching us shoot each other and think it's just hilarious. So hopefully we're going to avoid that in any case. But we will be talking about it. So to the disappointment of those two people, we will talk about it some. Other people who want to talk about that, we will be talking about it some, although again, I'm not going to get into the weeds. If you really want to get into the weeds, there's conferences here in the Sacramento area all the time about that. So what are we talking about if we're not talking about that? We're going to be talking hopefully about just what science actually is, hopefully moving frankly beyond the junior high definitions. Because most of what you see in pop culture really does stop at about the 8th grade level. Nothing wrong with being an 8th grader, but it really helps if you can move a little bit beyond that. Hopefully we're going to be talking also about what Christianity is, because a lot of the fusses about this is you can't believe X and still be a Christian. It's like, well, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you should believe X in order to be a Christian, but we'll be talking about that too. That's mostly week 3. The creation evolution issues, yeah, that's kind of week 4-ish. And then the one I'm kind of looking forward to that I'm still kind of working on, the thing that I think actually we probably should be worried about as Christians is week 5, and that gets into what does it mean to be a human. That, if anything, I think has been the question for about the last 50 to 75 years and will be a more acute question over the next 50 to 75 years. So the thing that your grandchildren are going to be dealing with, frankly, is not how old is the earth. It's going to be how do I deal with my neighbor who only wants me to talk to his avatar because he's uncomfortable with the gender he has in his actual body. That will be an interesting question. So we will be looking at that, things like that. So I'm going to just kind of shoot through some of this real quickly because this is generic stuff. I'm jumping around here a little bit. There's when I became a Christian, I actually became a Christian in a Pentecostal church, which and it was pretty hardcore Pentecostal, like verging on Foursquare gospel. Kind of if you were praying in English, it barely counted. So which was an interesting place to be. Because I, at that time, was going off to UC Berkeley to be a physics major. So, and they were very like, physics, wow, so you're going to study like science? And I'm like, yes, that's what I'm going to do. Oh, we'll pray for you. Okay, in tongues. So that's not as much of an issue when you get into sort of more middle of the road evangelicalism. Most people appreciate that part of loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength means loving God with your mind. And that hopefully we'll maybe get a little bit better at that in the next few weeks, or at least in a different way. It is something that American Christians, and particularly American evangelicals, tend to be kind of bad at. Has anyone here ever heard of Mark Knowles' The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind? 1992, Mark Knowles is a historian. I want to say he was at Whitworth, something that starts with Whit, Christian College. Anyway, he's a historian. Guess what the scandal, this book is like about 350 pages, and it basically covers the intellectual history of evangelicalism in the United States. Guess what the scandal of the evangelical mind is? That there isn't much of an evangelical mind. So, not trying to be mean here, but I mean, compared to, Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and Presbyterians, a lot of evangelicals just aren't that good at it. So hopefully that addresses a little bit of this because the rest of the world is moving forward with or without us. So now I'm going to try and make the future slides bigger, because I know that's kind of hard to read there. But my summary statement, you can think well about science or poorly about science or attempt to ignore it. All of these are ways of loving God with one's mind, just better or worse ways of doing so. So it's still God's universe. He made it. He designed it. He put it in order. He's going to see where it's going. And you can, again, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I'm not interested in that. That's fine. You're not saved on the basis of your science knowledge, but it's really actually kind of cool, I think. So. This is a huge topic. Realistically, I have about enough material for probably 2 undergrad semesters of science and Christianity classes. So that's why I'm going to talk like this a lot. Speaking of which, one of my besetting sins is talking too fast and using immense Byzantine words when small word work. So an overall thing you all need to be aware of, if I use a term and you're like, what is that? Then it is your job to raise your hand and say, what is that word you just used? Because chances are no one else in this room knows what it is either. And you are loving your neighbor by going forward and raising your hand and risking looking stupid, you won't, by asking about that. So that's just that's, again, one way of loving your neighbor here. You can't get around science, even for people that really don't like science, who are even in the, it's all a racket, you can't get away from it. If you own a smartphone, if you live in a house, then you have to deal with science. So none of you look Amish, and even if you are Amish, actually, you have to have an opinion about it on some level. So even the Amish families take their kids to the doctor when they get sick. So a lot of you heard my blurb already about who I am, why I'm talking about this. I do not consider myself a scientist. I work with a fair number of them, mostly in biomedical research. I'm a nurse anesthetist, so I do anesthesia all the time, and I work at UC Davis, so not a day goes by when there isn't somebody getting in my way who's trying to do a research study on one thing or another. So I'm very used to sort of the grunt work of science, doing data, following protocols, enrolling people. The higher level stuff of writing grants and theorizing is not something I tend to do. And we'll talk about this next week. That's not actually something most scientists spend a lot of time doing either. Most scientists are happy if by the end of their career they can point to 2 highly esoteric things that they helped improve. So the television picture of them writing on the whiteboard saying, "I've got it!" and then all of a sudden everything changes. That does happen maybe once every couple of decades to one scientist somewhere, or usually these days to a team. So even these days, even most Nobel Prizes are increasingly, it's routine now for you win a Nobel Prize along with these 6 other people that were working on the exact same thing. So this is going to sound a little strange. I was a relative latecomer to this whole science and religion thing. When you may think, well, yeah, didn't you come out of a Pentecostal background? Not really. The Pentecostal side of me was part of a sports ministry that this particular church had, so that was not where I was attending church, and these people were kind of weird, but they were nice to hang out with, and I got to do sports with them, so that's how I wound up there. When I actually got to Berkeley, I started attending a Presbyterian church, so for what it's worth, it was very conservative as PCUSA churches go. For those of you that are familiar with the PCUSA, that just means it was kind of middle of the road. Everyone else in town considered them the raving fundamentalists, which meant they were just middle of the road. So, and at that church, really, it had a lot of professors, a lot of students. The whole sort of how does science interact with Christian faith was just frankly not an issue. It was like, you have questions about that? Ask me the questions. Okay, what do you do about the days in Genesis? What do you do about that? It's like, well, did you read the text? Yes, I read the text. What does it say to you? It says that God created everything in 6 days. It's like, well, yeah, I think that's right. Next question. So no, it was just not an issue. So, and it was actually until I had gotten out of college that I realized that, wow, there are actually people that think the earth was made 6,000 years ago? Like that's not just in the movies? Now that may sound really naive to a lot of you, and it was, but that's just to put things in perspective, that's where I sort of came from. So I was a relative latecomer to many of these conversations. So I kind of, when I say who are my role models growing up, I didn't grow up in a Christian family. My dad was very explicitly agnostic, and my mother was kind of very, very mainline Protestant. Jesus was her savior, but she didn't make any claims about him being anybody else's savior. So when I say my 2 main role models growing up, everybody knows who the guy in the upper right is, right? How about the lower left? Carl Sagan, yes. So most famous for his Cosmos series that was revived a few years ago by Neil deGrasse Tyson. The thing I really liked about Carl Sagan at the time was he has a big picture of what the universe looks like. It's a beginning to end picture. In secular terms, it's a Genesis to Revelation picture of what the universe looks like, and that was very attractive to me. It's probably one of the things that one of the reasons I became a Christian is because Christianity has that same narrative that's literally Genesis to Revelation. and is ultimately a much more livable, evidenced, and happier philosophy. So one of the main things that drove me toward Christ was the fact that Carl Sagan tried really hard to be a mystic, and he pretty much failed. He was always trying to come up with some reason for staying alive and never quite got there. Any of you know this, any of his story? As he was dying, I forget what he died from, I think it was some form of cancer. He had his wife, Andrea, giving him LSD to sort of ease his transition into the universe. And that was kind of as close as he could get, which, I don't know, I find kind of depressing, but that it is what it is. So one of my main issues is that if you are going to stick with all the science and nothing but the science, you wind up with Bertrand Russell's problem. And I have this nice little quote here. It's kind of longish. But does anyone know who Bertrand Russell was? He was a writer. He's mostly philosopher. He was a professional philosopher. He died probably in 1987. So he arguably was probably one of the big three academic philosophers of the 20th century. So, and was very explicitly an atheist. He was kind of, he was a public intellectual. So he wrote a piece called A Free Man's Worship, and this was his summary statement. And it's like I say, it's very periodic English, so I'll try and read it in a way that makes sense. But that man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end to which they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All of these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. That doesn't strike me as the most happy philosophy in the world. Albert Camus, if any of you are familiar with 20th century existentialism, Albert Camus, painfully French, paraphrasing what he said, it's in French, but he basically, someone asked him, what is the meaning of life? His response was, the meaning of life is whatever keeps you from putting a gun in your mouth. It sounds like a 20th century French existentialist, yeah. So anyway, one of the reasons I became a Christian was because it was pretty obvious to me that if you just stick with nothing but science, that's kind of where you wind up sooner or later. So didn't want to go there, and discovered kind of actually more in retrospect that Christianity is a much sturdier philosophy anyway, but we'll get there later. So now, who are all of you people? That's the interesting question too. Again, there's about twice as many of you in here as I thought there would be, so it's a popular class, that's good. The little surveys I handed out, you guys are all over the place. There are people in here that do research for the state of California or for the federal government in resource and utilization and environment and chemistry and water quality. And there's other people that, yeah, I think I took a biology class in high school 45 years ago, I think. So, and everything in between. So that's good news and bad news. The good news is that we're relying on the people that are not nerds to keep the rest of us here in this room. And the people that are nerdy can share their nerdiness with us as necessary. So there's a great deal of variety in this group. It was interesting to me that a lot of people are not so much curious about science per se. They're curious on how you deal with being a Christian in sort of a science-obsessed culture. What do you do when someone says, well, you believe you're a Christian? Yes. Oh, so you believe the Bible? It's like, yes. Oh, I don't believe the Bible. I believe in science. Any of you seen Nacho Libre? Yeah. No, I do not believe in God. I believe in science. So just what do you do about that? Which is a valid question. It's interesting too, unfortunately too, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I know, because all of you are here because you have some interest in this. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of people who probably should be hearing this aren't here, which is people who either have written off the whole topic or are so absolutely certain of their position that there's just no moving anywhere. And to put it bluntly, if you're looking for the answer, if you want to go home at the end of tonight saying, okay, now I know the 3 things I have to do to think about science like a Christian, you probably won't get it. So unfortunately, I love nuance. I love shades of gray. If you like black and white and just tell me what to believe, then we'll do our best, I guess. Okay, so here's your first small group activity. You ready? Oh, first of all, did everybody get, this has the small group questions on it. Did anybody not get this who wants this? So for your first job is to, if there's just a couple people or 3 people at your table, this is easy. If there's more, then pick a spokesperson. And then answer these 3 questions in your group, and then I will come along in about 8 minutes and ask for a summary from your chairperson. How qualified do you feel yourself to be to talk about science and technology? How qualified do you feel yourself to be to talk about Christ and or the church? What are you hoping this class addresses, and is there anything you hope this class avoids? Obviously, some of those kind of overlap with the surveys I sent out, but not everybody sent those in. So, ready, set, go.
Okay.
Okay. You all have somebody who can give a summary statement? Where should I start? Who feels ready? You guys have a small group. Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay, let's see. I mean, let me look at my list. You don't have to necessarily go through each of these questions, but you can hit the high points. How qualified do you all feel either about science or Christianity? What was the year?
I do.
That's good.
Well, I'm truly a scientist. I mean, I'm a recovering engineer as well.
Okay, very good.
So I
Okay.
probably more qualified to talk about that.
Okay.
But I have opinions. I'll be happy to express about Christianity.
Very good. So yeah, and Dick, that's right. Okay, yeah. So anyway, Dick's an engineer. So, and I was saying earlier, you cover the gamut here. So some people feel very qualified to talk about science issues, others not so much. So that's good. So it's good to have people that know what they're doing. So actually, we'll talk about that too.
Wait a minute.
Well, yes, you'll be speaking next week.
I'm a recovery.
Very good. So what about over here? Any high points?
We don't know, we don't know everything, but we're reasonably comfortable in talking about things. Oh, microphone.
You have glasses for
Yes.
microphone.
So we talked about, we really don't know it. We don't know everything. So we're talking about science. We don't know everything, but we're reasonably comfortable with scientific discussions. Kind of approach them with humility and be open to other stuff. Yeah.
Anything you're hoping this class avoids?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
And that's good.
So, well, number one, how qualified do you feel? Robin's actually a scientist.
Oh yes, very good.
So, yeah, we're just kind of talking about like how, science is more like kind of touch, feel, see, and then the Christian faith is believing what you don't see. So
That's our big thing.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna write that one down because that's good. That's good. I think I am a recovering physics major, but I unfortunately or unfortunately have enough of a philosophy background that they were you all probably heard discussing Christianity is kind of science is based on what you can see, hear, touch, feel, measure, calculate, and Christianity is not. Okay, I will take that on one level, but we'll talk about it. But I'll give you some pushback next week. So the standard thing I hear is, what is an electron? Well, an electron is kind of like a spinning ball in space, except it's not a ball, it doesn't spin, it's not actually a particle, you can't tell where it is or where it's going or exactly what it does, and charge is just a conventionalization for how it behaves in relation to other particles. Other than that, we know exactly what it is. So anyway, we'll talk about that. It's interesting anyway. What did you all decide?
I'm the science junkie.
Okay, oh, you're the science junkie, very good.
Which means I go down lots of rabbit trails, and but basically
Use
we
the mic.
Oh, that's
to the
okay.
mic.
Yeah, you're good. We can hear
I
you.
know, can you hear? Okay.
that most of us are comfortable about the church and our faith. We're more uncomfortable with science, but we want to know about carbon dating.
Okay. We let me just sort of say for the record, when it comes to specific things like that, for instance, there is probably, fourth class is the best time to discuss that because that's when it comes up the most. But if we get to the end of some class like today, for instance, and you're like, but what about this, or what about that, or what about the other thing, then please do bring it up. The worst case scenario is I will say that's a dumb question, we're not talking about that, but I can pretty much guarantee that won't happen.
There are no dumb questions.
That's true. I can pretty much guarantee that won't happen. Now, the worst realistic cases will say, well, we're going to talk about that next week. And of course, if you're not there next week or something like that, then we can email or something. But but don't be afraid to ask the question, in other words, because that's what we're here for. So
We didn't get to what should we avoid.
oh yeah, that's fine.
Good evening, my name is Sam. So one of us out of the four of us here felt qualified to talk about science and technology. And then all four of us felt confident and qualified to talk about Christ and or his church. Specifically, we talked about the gospel, that we're very confident sharing that. We unfortunately didn't get through to the next questions, but I personally would hope through this class to gain more confidence and knowledge in the subject. And then I hope this class avoids nothing. I want to learn it all, know it all.
Very good.
Yeah, I want to add, because it's so important to understand the mission of the church nowadays is to speak with, we are made in the image of God. Because nowadays with transhumanism and what they're trying through the book of Revelation to create new man, new person, we have the image. That's why I think the church is under attack, because the devil doesn't want people to know that they are made in the image of God. So, because if people know we are made in the image of God, they cannot do anything to us. That's why it's the mission of the church. I want everyone to pray about it, to speak about humans made in the image of God versus transhumanism.
Yeah, and we will, we definitely, that's, definitely the last class is about 2/3 about that sort of thing.
Well,
So,
thank you, Tom.
so,
You
yeah,
understand
we're way ahead of you.
The urgency of it all.
Yeah.
The urgency.
Yeah, so I'm, in preparation for this class, I was, there's no reason here anybody would have heard of Yuval Noah Harari.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I know him pretty
Yeah.
good.
He wrote a book called Sapiens and another book called Homo Deus, which,
New Homo Deus.
yeah, and
Instead of Homo sapiens.
that quote by Bertrand Russell, he's very much in that vein. I mean, he's a hardcore materialist. There is nothing but matter, energy, space, time, and inexorable physical laws. And the job of humans is to just do whatever with that they can.
Yeah.
And there is no goal, there is no guide. There is, if you can do it, maybe you should. If you don't want to do it, maybe you shouldn't. But anyway, there is no guide. So, but anyway, that's what we were talking about the last week.
Okay, I would say that a lot of what has already been said is kind of where we're falling. Definitely no scientists at this table, but some with a little bit of background. And I think, one of the things that we talked about is that we're hoping to address is how to be confident in talking to others, non-believers about science and Christianity, and also the carbon dating I think is something that's very interesting. And when you're looking at what's taught in school, the billions of years, and then they're showing the carbon dating. I think that's something that's really interesting. And we didn't really have anything that we were wanting to avoid. We did talk a little bit about evolution and, that it's kind of it has been talked about a lot. And but really there's nothing that we were very adamant about.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and the recurring theme of, what do you, like I say, what do you do when somebody is just sort of, well, you can either be a Christian or you can believe in science, but not both. And hopefully, well, first of all, I'm going to stand on my soapbox for a minute. That's something that people in America in general are really bad at, talking about controversial subjects with each other. I mean, when you're with people, and I don't know if this is true of your experience, this is certainly true with me. When you're with people, like at my workplace, everybody's very nice and very polite, and the way you stay nice and polite is you don't talk about those things. And of course, when you're online, it's exactly the opposite. And then it's, oh, you're a Christian? Oh, so when did you have your brain removed? And just kind of, so, and hopefully we can bridge some kind of gap there, so.
So what you're talking about is kind of what we're thinking is we would love to get out of this class something about how to help share our faith with scientific, backing it up, because I'm not very scientific at all, and neither these are very much. Trevor is. He's an engineering major, but
excellent.
So yeah, just trying to be able to share that faith in a way where people ask us about science, and saying, well, that can't be true, and being able to express it, argue back to them, or not argue, but explain it to them, we'd love to get out of it.
Yeah. And that, that itself is kind of like, hopefully you can have discussions that don't degenerate into arguments, but actually have some content. Yeah. So, again, it frustrates me sometimes at work that if you even veer into that direction, people are like, whoa, hold on, we can't talk about that stuff because I might disagree with you and we don't want to do that. And I guess I'm getting older now and I have kind of a thicker skin, but, feel free to disagree with me. That's where it really gets interesting. So, who's your spokesperson?
I guess I am. You know what I think about all these
yes.
things. So.
Yes. Who are you again?
My name's Melanie Goodnow, and I'm your most favorite student. I came to this class because I think the teacher's cute. We have a lot of medical and sciencey people, not like scientists, but relative sciencey people. So we like to talk about that stuff, and we feel good about how that interacts with the Bible, and we're hoping the class, I don't know, did we talk about anything specific about that?
No, but I agree.
Just what? Oh yeah, Jennifer, what
Jay,
did you
you
say
had
about
one.
that? About
That
what
you
we were
wanted to get
hoping to get
class?
out. Way to call me out. No, I'm sorry. It's very similar to everything that everybody's been saying.
Okay.
Sharing our faith, talking to other people about it, feeling confident about talking to other people about it,
Okay.
and we hope this class talks about all the hard things. There you go.
Excellent.
Clearing up questions too.
Yeah.
That I have.
And let's see what's here. So these things we already talked about. Yeah, so there's certainly most of these things that people wanted to talk about, we kind of will be talking about. So a couple of people mentioned they mentioned carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. Radiometric dating in general is an interesting topic. It's a classic science topic in the sense that you can read a 6-page article about it and think you know everything about it, and then you can go to your local library and check out a 600-page book on radiometric dating, get to the end of it, and realize you didn't know anything at all about it. So is everyone here familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect? Does that ring any bells with anybody? I had a picture of it. The basic idea is that anytime there's a plane crash, if you go to your Facebook feed, suddenly your Facebook feed is exploding with people who are experts in aviation. Now, they may have never been inside a plane in their life outside of as a passenger, but suddenly they know everything about exactly what happened. This is what happened. It was a bird strike on the number 3 engine. That's what did it. And it was a goose. It wasn't a chicken. So that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. In other words, if you read just a little bit, if you watch a YouTube video, if you watch a TED Talk, suddenly you are the expert. And that's unfortunate because, of course, the way the graph goes is you're way over here. You know nothing and you know nothing. If I ask Bill, I have a brain tumor, can you help me out with that? He knows enough to know that the short answer is no, not really. Maybe I know a guy who knows some brain surgeons. I'll refer you. That's probably the best Bill could do. And that would be very appropriate. That's the right answer. Now, if somebody goes to a weekend workshop on how to treat brain tumors, as a layperson, they may come out at the end and says, I know exactly what you need for your brain tumor, and they're an idiot. So that's the peak of Mount Stupid. That's when you just start to know a little bit, and you hit the actual peak of Mount Stupid. Now, when you actually say, my friend Tommy had that brain tumor, and that was terrible. I wish I could do something to help people. I'm going to go to medical school. You go to medical school, you go through 4 years of medical school, you do your year of internship, you start your neurosurgical residency, you are way down here. You are in the trough of despair. You're an idiot and you will never know anything. Now, over the next 6 years of your neurosurgical residency, you will actually start to know things. And at the very end, by the time you're done with 6 years, your word will be, I feel like I don't know anything. There's so much to learn. And the reality is you are an expert at that point. So that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. Nobody is more stupid than the person who has just listened to a TED Talk about a highly esoteric subject. So, I forgot where I was going with that.
Carbon dating.
Yes, carbon dating is the classic example. I recently went to a conference on hosted by Genesis Apologetics, where they had about a 40-minute talk on radiocarbon dating. I am certainly not an expert in radiocarbon dating, but A, I didn't hear anything there that I didn't already know, and B, I heard some things there that I'm pretty sure were just not really actually correct. Again, was his heart in the right place? Yes. Did he know a fair bit about it? Yes. Am I an expert in it? No. But, if he and I sat down over some dinner, then I think there would be some interesting conversations there. And hopefully it's probably more a matter of he was just spitting it out there for lay audiences and wasn't going into all the details, which is appropriate. But that's how some of that works. So we will talk about radiocarbon dating, but I will not tell you everything you need to know about it because I don't know that much about it. So numerous people here kind of implicitly mention one of the big problems is it true that science and religion are constantly in conflict with one another, science and Christianity in particular? For most of and this is sometimes hard for people to believe, for most of the last 2,000 years there hasn't been a conflict. There just really hasn't. And if you pick nothing else out from this whole talk today, it's this idea that God wrote 2 books. Has anybody who's heard of this idea before? God writing 2 books? One person? Yeah. The idea is God wrote 2 books, the Bible and nature. And that's, this is a concept that goes very explicitly back at least to John Calvin, who mentioned that very explicitly, and especially Isaac Newton talked about it repeatedly. But it actually goes back to Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. It actually goes back to Augustine, right at the end of the Roman Empire, and it actually goes back to the Bible, believe it or not. I'm going to read to you something out of the Bible that is the most anti-biblical thing you'll ever hear. Not really. But the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day after day pours out speech, and night after night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor there are words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So does anyone know where that's from? Psalm 19. Psalm 19. So wait a minute, did the Bible just tell us that God doesn't need the Bible to talk to people? It's kind of what it looks like. Now, that's not to say that that you don't need the Bible, and it's not to say that you will figure out everything from nature, but it is to say that this has been a long-standing assumption in the Christian church, and by Christian I mean Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, even most heretical and out-to-lunch groups tend to agree with this, that there are 2 books. There's the book of special revelation, the Bible, and there's the book of general revelation, which is nature, which predominantly in today's society is through science. Not exclusively, but mostly. So that's the whole idea. So you can all go home now. And because they're written by the same author, they can't ultimately conflict with each other. There's not a way to do that. So the argument is when someone says, but science says, or but the Bible says, then that's usually either a failure of interpretation, a failure of imagination, or a failure to appreciate the limitations of that particular sphere of revelation. So a hobby horse I beat every now and then is when someone says, does the Bible have all the answers? No, the Bible does not have all the answers. If you want to know how much oil to put in your car, you will not find it in the Bible. So there are other sources of knowledge and information out there. Now, if you want to know what is a human, how did the universe get put together, what does it all mean, how are you a better person, then yes, it's in the Bible. But you won't find out information about radiocarbon dating in the Bible. So most of this sort of war of science and religion is a sitzkrieg. It's a phony war. But we'll talk about that more over the next 3 minutes. So now this is the boring part of the lecture. This is history, but I like history, so we're going to talk about this. Lock the doors. So here's an interesting question. Did they have science in ancient times or even through the Middle Ages? It depends very much on who you talk to and how you define science. That's kind of a little bit what we're going to talk about next week. But classical science, classical meaning, ancient Greeks and Romans, didn't really exist. I know I'll get some pushback from some people on that. But the idea is that if you wanted to know about nature and you went to Aristotle, who was a big authority, 4th century BC Greek, and he was very authoritative through even much of the High Middle Ages. And if you wanted to know about, say, how water froze, then you would go to Aristotle. And Aristotle would sit down and he would think, well, you have cold water and you have hot water. Which one freezes faster? If you put them outside on a really cold day, which one freezes faster? Wrong. Hot water freezes faster because water wants to be, water is cold, right? Most of the time you put your hands in water, it's cold. Water wants to be cold. So when you take water that's very hot, that water is in its non-natural state. And it wants to be cold, so it will energize itself toward getting cold faster. So it was actually believed through most of the Middle Ages that if you set a bucket of cold water out in the freezing cold and a bucket of hot water out in the freezing cold, the hot water would freeze faster. Most of us think, why would they think that? Because they were reasoning from primary principles. They were not doing experiments. Now, when the Middle Ages got in full swing, as we'll talk about on the next slide, people started actually doing experiments. They took a bucket of hot water and took a bucket of cold water when it was 15 degrees outside, and they saw which one froze faster. And guess what? The cold one froze faster. Big surprise. Now, the reason Aristotle probably didn't know that is because he was reasoning from principles, and because the idea of actually filling a bucket with water and taking it outside, that was work for women and slaves. And he was not a woman or a slave. So he was not going to do that. Okay, that's the way, those were the good old days. So, can you really do science if you have such an abhorrence of experimentation and even observation if you're just entirely reasoning from principles? Probably not. So I would argue that there was no such thing as science really until the High Middle Ages at least. So, and a side note, I don't think the pagan world actually had theology either. That was a uniquely at least Jewish and ultimately Christian invention. That if you went to a priest of Zeus and said, what is the nature of Zeus? Does Zeus have passions? Does Zeus have parts? How does he relate to Hera? Are Zeus and Hera, are they one in will and agreement, or are they always against each other? And the priest would say, these are good questions for philosophers. You would go to Aristotle and say, what is the nature of Zeus? Aristotle would say, Zeus is a foolish concept believed by the common people, and the real God is absolutely impassible and unknowable and lives out in the realm of the forms, and we don't really know anything about that. So if you can't know God either way, then there is no such thing as philosophy, really. So there was practice. You had to be pious, or Zeus might strike you down, but there was no thought that you had to know about Zeus. No one had a personal relationship with Zeus. That just did not happen. So, but when the Middle Ages actually did start get going, you had this fun thing where Europe was probably the most united it had ever been up until the mid-20th century. We're talking like period from about 900 to about 15 or 1600. And that surprises people because they're thinking, well, weren't there just wars all the time? Wasn't everybody fighting with everybody all the time? Yes, but there was a universal language, Latin. There was a universal religion, Christianity. And you'd be surprised at how mobile, at least upper class people were. It was routine for somebody to spend 3 weeks studying in Cambridge, and then they'd travel for 3 weeks, and they'd spend 2 years studying at the Sorbonne, and then they'd go down and they'd study at Padua for a couple of years, and then they'd come back to the Sorbonne and get their doctorate. And that was true while the wars were happening. So the nice thing is, if you were a traveling scholar and you came upon an army, then you just went around it and they generally ignored you. So it was actually, I wouldn't want to live there. There was a lot of, poxes and plagues and natural disasters and war and poverty and death, but it was not quite like Monty Python presents it. So the first real universities were founded, arguably the first one is the University of Bologna in Italy. Other ones, the Paris, Sorbonne, Oxford, and Cambridge shortly thereafter. Here's this guy. Does anyone know what a dunce cap is? You have to be pretty old to know what that is. But it was named after this guy very unfairly. This is Duns Scotus. He was a 13th century, he was a Scotsman actually, if I remember correctly. Yes, born in Scotland. But he studied all through Europe, and again, that's because he knew Latin. He didn't care what anybody spoke Gaelic or English. The important thing was he spoke Latin. Everybody repeat after me, University of Being. University of Being. What do you think that is? This is a really bizarre concept when I looked into it. And the reason it's bizarre is because all of you in here believe it already, you just don't know that you believed it, and you believed it for your entire life. The University of Being says that God mirrors, or more properly, we mirror his properties. So in other words, when it says God is angry, that in some sense, it doesn't mean it's exactly like human anger, but we can understand when it says God is angry because we've seen people who are angry. There's a university of being. We have some similarities with each other. Again, this idea of we're made in the image of God. So therefore, there is some parallels there. Again, it's not the Aristotelian concept that God is just out there and unknowable and impassible and immovable and eternal and never does anything. But nor is it this idea that God is just a dude, kind of like, zaps people with thunderbolts and gets people pregnant. That's that's the Zeus idea. So the univocity of being, and this is important to science because what it means is that you can actually think about the world that God created because you have something like the mind of God inside you. So if it made sense to God, it can make sense to you. So that's the univocity of being. And again, that seems kind of obvious to all of us. It's like, well, of course, is God a being? Does God have a person? Yes, kind of like, not like humans, but sort of like that. So, and that, that's Charlie Brown Christmas, it's all over there. And here's the other guy, William of Ockham. Have anyone heard of Occam's razor? Yes. Yeah, that's a pretty common. The other thing you'll sometimes hear about Middle Ages medieval science is that everyone was just parroting Aristotle. Aristotle was certainly an important authority, but similar to the university system today, if you really wanted to make a name for yourself, you disagreed with Aristotle. You came up with something new and you argued with Aristotle. And the works of Aristotle that have survived to today are mostly from manuscripts from this period. But if you're really a scholar of Aristotle, then you appreciate the fact that there's, something like 80 or so manuscripts of Aristotle's works of various kinds through the Middle Ages. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of commentaries on Aristotle. If all of Aristotle's works disappeared tomorrow, you could entirely reconstruct them from all these other commentaries because everyone was arguing with him all the time. So William of Ockham was one of those guys who argued with him. And this was actually contra Plato, although Plato wasn't really well known yet. Occam argued that there was no such thing as an ideal dog. You knew what a dog was because you saw lots of dogs and you kind of put together the idea of what a dog was. This is contrary to the Platonic ideal that somewhere in space is an ideal dog, capital G dog, and all other dogs strive to be like that dog. Aristotle, and then especially William of Ockham, said that's nonsense. A dog is a dog. You know what a dog is because you've seen lots of dogs, and if all the dogs disappeared from the world, there would be no more dogs anywhere. The reason this is important is because, again, it lets you experiment. You don't just sit there and think about what water wants to be. You actually find some water and you do experiments with it. So these were medieval inventions. And again, it kind of surprises people that people didn't think of this before because that's just kind of assumed. If you want to know what water does, then you do something with water. It's like, well, that just makes you a modern Westerner. The other thing Occam was famous for that will come up later is Occam's razor. Let's see here. Enti non sunt multiplicanda sine necessitate. Explanations should not be multiplied beyond necessity. What that does not mean is that you always prefer the simplest explanation. That means you always prefer the simplest explanation that actually explains what you're looking at. So, but like I say, we'll talk about that a lot in the fourth class. So here's a question for you that I ask people on the internet when I get into arguments all the time. How many scientists have been formally persecuted by the church in the last 1,000 years?
Galileo.
Okay, Galileo.
Kepler.
Kepler. Yeah, okay. Kind of. He wasn't liked. Okay, yeah, again, it depends a little bit on how you define persecution. He had a powerful patron who kept his other people off his back, but Darwin, maybe. Again, depends on how you define persecution. I know I've been in discussions online especially, where the argument is, do you know how many thousands of scientists the church persecuted over the centuries? And I'll always say, how many thousands were there? Oh, thousands. It's like, well, no, Galileo always comes up. You know why Galileo always comes up? Because he's about the only example. So, was Darwin well, again, Darwin, Kepler, Copernicus, people didn't like them. Were they persecuted? Well, like I say, it depends on your definition of persecuted. Darwin, died in relative comfort for a 19th century man. So the two people that always come up is this guy. The only reason I bring him up is because he will occasionally come up at conversations. Giordano Bruno. He was a little bit younger than Galileo. A little bit, he was basically 16th century. It's arguable whether he was even a scientist. He was certainly a natural philosopher. Trivia question, does anyone know when the first use of the word scientist occurred? The first time somebody was called, hey, you're a scientist, aren't you? The first time anyone could say that. I think it was 1834. So, which is much later than anyone expects. Before this, everyone was just a natural philosopher. I mean, I think even Darwin considered himself a natural philosopher. I don't think he called himself a scientist. So, and it's because you're a philosopher and you're doing nature. So Giordano Bruno was arguably not even a natural philosopher. He was a hermeticist. Does anyone know what a hermeticist is? It means he was into conspiracy theories. I mean, that's not quite what it means. He means he was into medieval mysticism in the Hermetic tradition, which looked a lot at, it was meshed with alchemy and astrology and a lot of sort of, prophecies. This was long before Nostradamus, but it was kind of like that sort of stuff. So he did have various speculations about the heavens. He was into heliocentrism. He thought the earth revolved around the sun. That's kind of crazy. And he believed that there might even be other worlds where other beings existed. That's kind of crazy. That's really crazy. Yeah, but the reason they actually burned him at the stake was because he denied the existence of hell, the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, believed in reincarnation, thought the Trinity was nonsense, a bunch of other stuff. So it's extremely debatable whether he was persecuted for his science anyway. He was really burned because he was a heretic. And then finally, here's the big guy, Galileo. Like I say, you could give a whole 2-hour talk just on Galileo. It was a perfect collision of politics, religion, and culture. The church at the time of Galileo was in the midst of the Counter-Reformation. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Martin Luther came along and John Calvin shortly thereafter, and then eventually William and Henry VIII, and started the Reformation. And the Catholic Church sort of freaked out, and the Counter-Reformation started. So it was, and Galileo kind of got swept up in that. He was in Italy, which was very much in the center of the Counter-Reformation. He was also kind of a jerk, apparently. He repeatedly called the Pope a moron. That, and I'm not joking there. It's what is it? The Pope he wrote this allegory, and the Pope's character was, it wasn't moron, I think it was idiotes. That was like, and who's arguing for the sun revolving around the earth. So anyway, like I say, it's a very complicated story, and it's actually very interesting. It's very much a soap opera. It would surprise me a little if they haven't done a movie on it yet. They should anyway. It would be a really excellent period drama.
What is heliocentrism? Is that
This is heliocentrism. Heliocentrism is the sun is at the center, as opposed to geocentrism, which is the earth is at the center. So for a long time, basically up until about the mid-1500s, the heliocentric model, which is the one on geocentric, which is the one on the left, the earth is stationary and everything revolves around the earth. Part of the fuss with Galileo was that there were two reasons why he got a lot of pushback from a rational level. I mean, besides the fact that he was a jerk and called the Pope a moron. Sort of people arguing with him argued for two reasons. One, the Bible says, it says right there in the Bible, the earth shall not be moved. It says that right there in the Bible. It says in Joshua that the sun stood still. Come on, Galileo, what do we have to, you can read it as well as we can. That's what it says. And of course, Galileo got himself into trouble when he says, but doesn't it also say that the earth trembles? And then everybody says, I think you need to shut up now. So, but anyway, there were theologians that argued against Galileo's position. Believe it or not, some of the most vocal of his opponents were other natural philosophers that basically said, your observations are incorrect. Your observations are flawed. They don't do any better a job of describing the phenomena than the geocentric version. You have the sun at the center and everything revolving around the sun, but except for the moon, which revolves around the earth, and except for maybe these moons of Jupiter that you're claiming that revolve around Jupiter, and except Venus that goes through these phases, this is all really complicated. Didn't we not learn anything from William of Ockham? Look how simple the geocentric model is. That's simple. Now, the planets do go back and forth. You have to have these epicycles where the planets kind of go in circles in their orbits, but that's simple. And it does actually adequately describe the movement of the planets. So you can work it out on mathematically. It does work up to a point. Now that up to a point is the issue. So if you're really trying to do transatlantic navigation and do it well, then you need to have good clocks, and by the time you have really good clocks and really good transatlantic navigation, you start to appreciate that geocentrism doesn't work. But Galileo didn't have any of those things. So.
Are there other biblical, and I can't think off the top of my head, besides where it says the earth doesn't move or the sun doesn't move, other things in the Bible where it clearly states that it is a heliocentric solar system. I'm going to have to find this, but yeah, I think that there were things. Not that Galileo was coming for that, but biblically it kind of explains. I'm going to do this. It's going to be a research.
Yeah. There is.
Yeah, it's my homework.
There is sort of. I'm going to say, some. This kind of gets actually into this idea. The lessons for us with the Galileo affair. First of all, again, when you're talking to people about it, the dispute was between mostly Galileo and other philosophers. I mean, if you try and factor out all of the personality issues. And some of the dispute, too, is whether the church had the right or even the obligation to ensure unity of thought. In other words, if you're going to say that Galileo was a martyr, you could say maybe he was a martyr for free thought or for questioning, but to say he was a martyr for science is probably even pushing it a little too hard. Now, of course, kind of what you're referring to, our easy response today is, well, the church was interpreting it wrong. When it says, when you're in the Valley of Ajalon, when Joshua said, sun stand still, the sun stood still, but that doesn't mean that the sun was actually moving. That just means that Joshua looked up and there was the sun, and he looked up 20 minutes later and the sun was still sitting there. The Bible doesn't make any claim from that this is how the solar system is put together. So there are, let me put it this way. I know you can certainly be a heliocentrist and be very comfortable with other biblical passages. For instance, the idea that the planets move, I'd have to think about it. Here's the next big guy, and he's kind of important for a variety of reasons. Who's that guy? Isaac Newton. He's famous for he's probably most famous for his, having the apple fall on his head. He wrote more on mathematics than he wrote on physics, and he wrote more on astrology than he wrote on mathematics, and he wrote more on theology than he wrote on astrology. So I won't say it was a hobby for him.
Did you say astrology?
Astrology. He was probably the last respectable astrologer. And that's surprising to people because it's like, you can't believe in astrology and be a Christian, right? It's like, well, I don't think it depends on what you mean by believe in. I don't think you can be today. Certainly in Newton's time, it was pretty routine that you could be a very devout believer, Protestant or Catholic, and still visit an astrologer. And the thought was, God can still tell you things through the motion of the stars. So it wasn't quite the loosey-goosey thing that you see today about your sun signs and your aura and getting your chakras aligned and all that. So yeah, he actually did write quite a bit on astrology, and it was considered a science at the time. So yeah, that's a little weird. And like I say, he was kind of the last respectable astrologer. Basically, his own work undermined most of astrology. So because his own work said basically this is how the heavens run together. Even more than Kepler, who's the guy who just realized that planets don't actually move in circles, but ellipses. He put astronomy and science generally on a mathematical basis. There's some debate as to whether he invented calculus or Leibniz did. Really, they both kind of did. And the most important thing from our perspective is he's the first guy that really started to put the universe together as a clockwork mechanism, that it just kind of runs. He gave rise to this guy about 150 years later, Simon Laplace. He's very French. Here's the story that, here's a little quotation from Laplace. It's generally referred to as Laplace's demon. And he doesn't mean demon in the sense of demon, D-A-E-M-O-N, daemon, kind of more spiritual force. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect, this is his demon, which at a certain moment would know all the forces that set nature in motion and all the positions of all the items which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be like the present to it. So, and this is still, you still see people kind of think about this. It's like if you knew where every atom, every particle in the universe was right now, and how it was interacting with every other particle right now, then you would know how every particle reacted with every other particle through the history of the entire universe. Now, that all fell to ruin in the 1920s with the rise of quantum mechanics, but up until then, people were like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, if everything is determined mechanistically, then it all makes sense. There's a famous story where Laplace talked to Napoleon. Someone had told Napoleon that his book, Laplace's book about this, contained no mention of the name of God. Napoleon, who was fond of putting embarrassing questions to his guest, received it with this remark, Monsieur Laplace, they tell me, oh, here we go. Monsieur Laplace, they tell me you have written this large book on the system of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator. Laplace, who, though the most supple of politicians, was as stiff as a martyr on the point of his philosophy, drew himself up and answered bluntly, okay, let's see if I can do this. Je ne vais pas besoin de cette hypothèse, cette hypothèse-là. I have no use for that hypothesis. Because God had no purpose in his universe. All the particles were moving. They were moving in accordance with natural law. They bumped into each other mathematically. They bumped off of each other mathematically and went on to interact with other particles mathematically. Where is God? I don't see a God in there anywhere. We'll just, yes. Well, take a question, then we'll take a break. Yes.
That was my question. Sorry. Because you said there were no dumb questions, so
Yeah.
I'm raising to ask if we can do a 5-minute restroom break or something.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. The restroom break is now. Yes. Yes, we're up to the modern era. There's this guy's the guy we're going to talk about next. Everybody knows who that is, probably. Charles Darwin. Anyway, so yes, take a 10-minute break and then we'll resume. Okay, don't worry, we just got to the United States. So, and we'll discuss how everything that's bad is the fault of the Reformation. No, not really. But there is an argument about that, but I don't buy all of it, but anyway. So, you've heard kind of how science goes. This is where we're actually getting to the point where, not surprisingly, with somebody like, Laplace, the French dude, that guy, was obviously not a fan of religion. This was in the middle of the French Revolution, when they were literally, beheading priests. This was kind of the beginning of the end for the happy relations between science and Christianity. But wait, it gets worse. There was also the rise of religious pluralisms. Has anybody here heard of the 30 Years' War?
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know, do kids learn about the 30 Years' War in school today? Anyway, the 30 Years' War was, I forget what 30 years it was. It was basically the end of the beginning of the 1600s. 1618 to 1648, there you go. And it was, it's usually stereotyped as sort of a Protestant on Catholic war, and it kind of was that, but there was at least as much politics as there was religion. But what the net effect was that everybody came out of it saying, was it the Treaty of Westphalia? I think it was, which incidentally also put in place a lot of Western norms for how you're supposed to conduct warfare. Like, burning peasants alive in their villages is frowned upon, and the 30 Years' War, they did a lot of that. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, they were like, that was a stupid idea. So the modern rules of engagement went back to some of that. So anyway, one of the effects of the 30 Years' War was that people decided they really didn't like religion, generally. I don't care if you're Protestant, I don't care if you're Catholic, just stop beheading everybody else. That was made worse by the Counter-Reformation. The 30 Years' War happened kind of at the end of the Counter-Reformation. You had a certain, even within Protestantism, there was a certain sclerosis. There was, a lot of people are like, Protestantism is really rational and really logical and has a lot of learned people, and they're all losers. I mean, that was kind of a lot of the common appeal. This is where a lot of more pietism arose, which frankly is kind of the history of Creekside Christian Church if you go back far enough. Creekside Christian Church is a Protestant church, but it kind of comes out of a Baptist tradition, and most Baptists came out of the sort of the early 1600s, late 1500s. Officially Baptists are Protestants, but guess who? Yes, sir.
Can you repeat what you said about the apples, right, with these how we came out of that, how you both came out of that?
The Creekside Christian Church, officially, I think we're officially non-denominational. I think we're still considered North American Baptist. So basically, it's Baptist. Baptists came out of Protestantism. There was no, I won't say there were no Baptist groups that came out of Catholicism, because there probably were, but I don't know if any of them are still around. But the idea of being a Baptist church, i.e. you baptize adults, you do credo baptism, not pedo baptism, that came out of Protestant groups, kind of end of the 1500s, beginning of 1600s, depending on the particular group. The interesting thing is, who do you think actually killed more Baptists, Protestants or Catholics? Protestants, yes. And in the ultimate irony, one of the more popular way to kill Baptists was by drowning them. That was just hilarious. So I'm not joking about it. I wish I were joking about that, but yeah, that actually was kind of like that. That was a thing. So yeah. So anyway, there was the 30 Years' War. There was all this religious strife, and people were kind of tired of it in general.
Sorry, I don't have a question. Is there any way to turn down some of the lights? There's a lot of glare looking at the windows.
I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, is that better?
There we go. Yeah. Oh, the red light too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you.
Anyway, people were, to a certain extent, were tired of religion generally. A lot of war, a lot of problems, and a lot of schism. What religion were you? Well, I don't know. Who's king this year? Kind of that decided what religion you were. So, and that's one of the reasons the United States came into existence, is because people were kind of tired of it, and they all came over here to found the perfect religious society, whether you were a Protestant or whether you were a Puritan or a Quaker or whatever you were. The net result was what we all today know as religious pluralism. The idea that you could pick your religion is kind of weird historically, up until about 200 years ago or so. That if this was 14th century France, then you were one of two things. You were a Catholic, or you were a schismatic and you were on the run and you were probably a heretic. If you were a Jew, we might put up with you. If you were a Muslim, we would put up with you if you're just kind of passing through town. But generally speaking, if this was 13th century France, you were a Catholic. If this was 18th century England, you were a Protestant. Unless you were in Ireland, in which case you fought with each other. If you were in northern Germany, you were a Lutheran. If you were in southern Germany, you were a Catholic. And if you didn't like the local Catholic church and you lived in Bavaria, then your choices were get used to it or just don't go to church. So this idea of, I don't like the church, so I'm going to go find a new church, is a bizarre idea for most people throughout most of history. So the downside of this was, and you'll see this doesn't actually make any logical sense, but I've long lost count of the number of times I've heard people say this. Since it's obviously inconceivable that all religions can be right, the most reasonable conclusion is that they are all wrong. Again, that doesn't logically make any sense. I mean, there's literally an infinite number of wrong answers to any question. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as a right answer. So it doesn't make any logical sense, but on sort of a visceral level, you'd be amazed how often people kind of go with that. You can't really know what can you really know anyway? Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, whatever, just pick somebody and go with it already. It doesn't need, or nobody, just do the enlightened thing and just go with nothing. Okay, so I mean, that's, obviously the most common thought in the world at large. So, and it kind of started back here. So I was joking about blame it on the Reformation, but to a certain extent there is something there. Because, again, if you're in 13th century France and you wanted to know what the Bible meant, you know where to go. You went to your local priest, and if you thought your priest didn't know enough or was a little wacky, then you could find the bishop. And if the bishop didn't know, then he could hold a disputation, he could petition the Pope, there was ways to find out, and that was the answer. The problem with the Protestant Reformation is now it's everybody. You just pick up your Bible and you read it and you just do what it says. That's great in theory, but the problem is that there's at least 1,500 year difference between where you are as a 16th century Englishman and where the Bible was. So, it had its downside. And it was basically in a loss of authority. That achieved its ultimate expression in the United States, where you did have formalized religious pluralism. The anti-establishment clause there, the United States shall make no law concerning the establishment of religion or free exercise thereof. That whole thing, it's in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So if you don't like the Protestant church down the street from you, you go one block over and pick a different Protestant church. And if you don't like either of those, you go one block over and pick the Catholic church. And in the midst of this, dropped these two bombs. Darwin, everyone knows about Charles Darwin, there he is. And German higher criticism. Has anyone heard of that concept? Yeah, a couple people. For all the press that Darwin gets, I think actually that the German higher critical problem was much more important in the long run, as we'll talk about in a second. So Darwin wrote, first of all, has anyone here read Origin of the Species? I listened to it. Does that count? First of all, if you actually read it or look at it, it's actually pretty modest in its assertions. I mean, he discusses, this is how different species of animals arose, but that's about it. He does back it up with some data, with some evidence, with some argument, but most of what is today evolutionary theory is only sort of somewhat related to Darwin. I mean, it certainly goes back to him, but it's a little bit like saying modern astronomy is all about Copernicus and Galileo. Modern astronomers certainly do not ignore them, but the real revolutions are in astrophysics and space telescopes and relativity and gravity and superclusters and the Big Bang. That's where the real work of astronomy is today. In evolutionary theory, the real work is in genetics and in informatics and in theories around mutation and population genetics. And Darwin certainly dealt with that, but it was only a foundation. And like I said here, neither Darwin nor the Origin of the Species was exactly hostile to Christianity. Darwin considered himself a Christian until the day he died, but it was very sort of loosey-goosey, kind of like he never attended church. He had a lot of issues with, he lost a couple children, which was not uncommon in the 19th century, and had a hard time with the problem of evil, basically. The other interesting thing about when the theory of evolution was first propounded, we're talking like 1870s, 1880s, it was not particularly controversial even in Christian circles. For instance, if anyone's heard of B.B. Warfield, famous 19th century pastor, he was kind of the John MacArthur of his day. He didn't really have a problem with it. And most of his fellow theologians at Princeton, which at that time was a very conservative institution, didn't have any problems either. The problem is, when you get to this guy, who knows where that is? Richard Dawkins. When you take Darwinism and you marry it to materialism and physicalism and empiricism, this idea that not only are the species related to each other, but they are all the result of Laplace's idea of you just have a bunch of atoms smashing into each other and bam, you get a monkey and bam, you get a human. When you start putting all these things together, then you get Richard Dawkins, who is a very wonderful writer. By all accounts, he's a very nice man if you're not an attractive young woman. And he, wait, did I say that? Did I say that or did I only think it? Anyway, there's some controversies there, but I won't belabor those. He's famous for the saying, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. In other words, for him, Darwinism married, again, with naturalism, the idea that everything is the result of physical laws that cannot change or be overridden, acting on atoms and molecules that just do what they do. When you put all this together, then you have the answer to everything. And he's also famous for this statement, which he actually instantiates very poorly. He's quite the moralist, actually, but should I do my best Richard Dawkins accent? The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Again, he was really bad at actually believing that because he's very much like this is right and this is wrong, and you can't really come up with that in a godless universe, but that's his assertion. And then where these came together in at least the popular imagination, this is going back before Dawkins. Dawkins is like 1990s. He's still alive. He's kind of fallen off the radar in the last 10 years or so. But has anyone here heard of the Scopes monkey trial? So this picture here that's Dick York. I always think of him from being from Bewitched. But yeah, but yes, but he played John, well, his name was actually not John Scopes in the movie. They sort of vaguely fictionalized things for the movie. But there was the movie that was kind of based loosely on the, what was the name of the book? Inherit the Wind. The Tennessee law, this was in the 1920s, they passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools, and the ACLU wanted a test case. And so they basically sort of pulled a bunch of biology teachers, and John Scopes said, hey, I'll do it. So he was officially arrested and put on trial. In the final analysis, they actually ruled against him and fined him $100 and told him to stop it. The ACLU paid the whole fine. The whole decision was overturned a few months later on a technicality. It basically went nowhere. But it fired the public imagination because it was quite the media circus, partly because of the defense and prosecution. The defense was Clarence Darrow, and the prosecution was William Jennings Bryan, who you may or may not have heard of. He was a many times presidential candidate. And it was quite the circus because at one point, and probably the biggest mistake that Bryan made during the whole thing was he allowed himself to be put on the stand and cross-examined by Clarence Darrow, who asked him all these kind of off-the-wall questions about the Bible. And then William Jennings Bryan died of a stroke 3 days later. But what this really did in the public imagination was it set in place most of the stereotypes that you'll hear today, which is if you don't believe in evolution, you're a Tennessean hick who doesn't really know anything, is probably really stupid and kind of a bigot, and you're certainly white racist. That's, everybody just knows that. Well, no, they know it because of this movie, basically. So it's debatable whether that was ever true, but it was at least true in the movie. So, and here's where, like I say, this is where I think we're getting the more important side of things. The evolution Scopes monkey trial thing was a bit of a circus, but this is where, in my opinion, where the actual movement was occurring, and that was in the fundamentalist modernist controversies. Mostly German higher criticism, and when I say German higher criticism, what it means is German scholars, mostly theologians, mostly pastors and priests, who were doing analysis of biblical texts. Probably, arguably one of the most famous of them was it Tischendorf? He was the guy who discovered the Codex Sinaiticus, which is still the oldest complete Bible in the world, 380 AD, I think. Exists in British Museum? Don't quote me on that. Anyway, you can see it if you want. But so they did do a lot of interesting things with textual critical studies, archaeology. It actually was fairly important stuff. But one of the things they did also was they said, hey, this is gross simplification, they said, hey, science is doing a lot of cool stuff. What if we used science and used the scientific method on the Bible? Now, today we can look at that and say, you can't really use science on texts. You can use it on the physical text. You can do radiocarbon dating of the text you want. You can analyze the ink. But you can't do science on a biblical text. Because one of the classic results of this was, did I put it on here? I don't think I did. One of the higher critical issues, I want to say, I don't think this was Tischendorf, came with what's known as the documentary hypothesis, which was looking at the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, analyzing the way the names of God appeared in there, whether it was Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, what was the name of God, and splitting that up and deciding this part was authored by this guy, this part was authored by this guy, this part was authored by this guy, and then they smashed them all together and said it was all authored by Moses, and we all know that's wrong now. That's an interesting theory. It was kind of orthodoxy for probably 100 years, from about 1880 up until about 1980. And in about 1980, actually, biblical scholars started looking at saying, you can't actually do that to texts. That you analyze texts using textual tools, you don't analyze texts using scientific tools, because science doesn't work like that. We'll talk about that next week. But the net result of all this was an overall skepticism about the Bible. So that, and the place where this really came to a head was in Princeton. Like I say, B.B. Warfield was a conservative Princetonian, and he basically got kicked out of his institution eventually for being too conservative. In the midst of all this came the fundamentals. And this is the actual root of the word fundamentalism, which is now such a loosey-goosey word, it doesn't mean anything anymore. A fundamentalist now is anyone who's more conservative than me and makes me uncomfortable. But there was an official thing called the Fundamentals, which was a 2-volume set published by the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, now known as Biola, in about 1917, I was going to say 1920, in about 1917. Initially in 4 volumes, they had a 2-volume set eventually. And they had, this was basically their statement of what Christians should believe. We think of fundamentalism now as being kind of a reactionary thing. If you actually read the fundamentals and flip through it, it just kind of sounds normal. In other words, we'll talk about this the week after next, but in other words, it's Orthodox Christianity as opposed to liberal mainline Christianity where, where Mary made up this story about being impregnated by the Holy Ghost because she didn't want Joseph to know she was fooling around, and Jesus rose from the dead spiritually, because we know because of Laplace that no one can physically rise from the dead because that's silly. So in response to all this, the fundamentals were created. They mailed them out to just about every pastor and missionary in the United States, as well as all the directors of all the YMCAs and YWCAs. And I think it's actually a fairly interesting read. They talked about the virgin birth, the deity of Christ. They did, guess what they didn't talk about? They didn't talk about evolution because that was considered a non-issue. It's like, did God make humans that way? Sure, whatever. The important thing is the virgin birth and the resurrection, the inerrancy of the Bible. They were comfortable with a young earth, they were comfortable with an old earth. If you really want to look into it, I actually put a little links in your little pages there. You can actually go and get a digital copy of the fundamentals. And like I say, it's actually fairly interesting reading. It would actually make not a bad catechism. I mean, it's all pretty basic, solid stuff. But it was controversial because it wasn't modern and scientific. Out of all this arose what is broadly known as the conflict thesis. It was alluded to in the fundamentals, but they didn't even spend much time on it. The basic thesis is this: there is an intrinsic intellectual conflict between religion and science, and that inevitably leads to hostility. The idea, if you want to be a Christian, that's fine, be a Christian, but you have to check your brain at the door. On the one hand, given Laplace, given Darwin, given German higher criticism, you can see how this is kind of plausible. The problem is it was just really bad history. So where did it come from? The reason I sort of belabor this is because you'll hear this all the time. That there's a war between religion and science, and you have to pick which side you're on. And my assertion is, no, actually you don't. But this started, has anyone heard of Washington Irving? I only know him because of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but he actually wrote a lot of stuff. And he was actually the origin of the idea that people in the Middle Ages thought the Earth was flat. How many people in the Middle Ages actually thought the Earth was flat? None of them. No, I mean, okay, yeah, you could find a peasant out, toiling behind an ox in a field somewhere, and he might think the Earth was flat. But anybody who had any stitch of education knew the world was round, and they even had a pretty good idea of how big it was. And the biggest argument against Columbus was not that they thought he was going to sail off the edge of the world, it's that they thought he was going to starve to death in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And if North and South America hadn't gotten in the way, he would have starved in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So, yeah. The two big boogeymen of the conflict thesis are John Draper and Andrew Dixon White. They were both public intellectuals in the 19th century around the time of the Civil War and immediately thereafter. Draper wrote History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon White, who he was a founder of Cornell University, so he had some intellectual chops. He wrote The History of Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom in about 800 pages. So if somebody wants to read that and summarize it for me by next week, that'd be great. So what they argued, that it's pretty obvious in the titles, that religion and Christianity hate each other. They've never gotten along, and they never will get along because they are inherently in conflict with each other. The trick was that this was at least as much anti-Catholic as it was anti-Christian. These guys were both resolutely Protestant in a time when there were a lot of Catholics flooding into the United States. Those darn immigrants. The Irish, can't stand the Irish. The Italians are worse. Anyway, they're Catholic, that's the worst thing of all. So, and obviously we don't want those people in this country, so here's this story too, how, look what the Catholic Church has done to science throughout the centuries. The chief problem with the conflict thesis was it's wrong. It's just, it doesn't hold up well under analysis. You still hear it all the time. Religion has always been in conflict. Here's the idea. Constantine suppressed classical learning and science. He burned all the most interesting texts of antiquity and replaced them with stale prayer books and Bibles that he created. The Dark Ages resulted. There was the persecution of thousands of scientists like Bruno and Galileo. Okay, well, this is the narrative, and you still, like I say, you still hear it today. If you don't believe me, go to the internet and put in religion and science, and there you go. This was once described to me as the worst graph on the internet. I don't know if you can see it well enough, but basically you've got this nice little upward curve with the Egyptians in yellow, and then you've got the Greeks in blue, and you've got the Romans in green, and then look, there's this disaster. What was that disaster? The church, Constantine. And look, now we're in this pit, and this pit just goes and goes and goes until finally the Enlightenment happens, and Simon Pierre Laplace is born, and everybody gets smart again, and now we're going back up again. Look at that huge hole. We could have been flying to the stars by now if it weren't for those darn Christians. So, and again, the problem with this theory is not that it's an interesting theory, it's just wrong. It just doesn't actually mesh. I also put in your notes, if you want a more specific response, these are both a couple of books that I sort of highly recommend to people that are looking at this issue in particular. Rodney Stark, if any of you have heard of him, he's a sociologist and historian out of, I want to say Duke, somewhere back east. He wrote several books, but there's one called The Victory of Reason, or there's one also called How the West Won, which is basically a rebuttal to the conflict thesis. This is how Christianity gave rise to science, is his argument. There's another one, and this I sometimes refer to people like, well, Rodney Stark, he's Catholic, of course he's going to think that. Well, okay, if you want an atheist, then go to Tom Holland. He's very explicitly an atheist, also a historian, and he wrote a book called How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. His basic argument is that if Christianity hadn't come along, we'd still be in the decaying remains of the Roman Empire. It's because Christianity came along, and people like Duns Scotus, and people like William of Ockham, and Isaac Newton, and Kepler, and Galileo. That's the reason why you have smartphones today, not because the Romans were smart. And for what it's worth, you still see the conflict thesis taught sometimes. It's mostly just in popular media now. You almost never see it in high schools, and you'll never see it in colleges anymore. Most historians today know that Draper and White were just kind of getting high on their own supply and weren't really doing very good history. So you hear it, if you hear the conflict thesis, you hear it as this was an interesting theory they had during the late 19th and early 20th century that no one really believes anymore about the nature between religion and science. So it's still very popular. Like I say, you'll see it on the interwebs all the time, but if you actually go to university history departments, you pretty much don't hear about it anymore. So why does the thesis persist? Frankly, because it makes people happy. If you are a skeptic and you really don't like the idea of Christian belief, it seems kind of primitive and kind of conservative and kind of just sort of, icky, then this fits the model. Of course, I want to be a good rational person, which means, of course, I'm not a Christian. And look, here's this thesis that explains all about why I'm rational and why all those people are weird. Believe it or not, this is the more controversial side. Everyone's saying, oh yes, that's so true. Here's the part that you're going to hate. It's also encouraged by Christians for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is the sense, particularly in some parts of Christian pietism, like the church I became a Christian in, for instance, the Pentecostal Foursquare Gospel Church, where to get an education is to become less holy. That if you go off to the university, we will pray for you because that is a den of wolves. On one hand, I appreciate where that comes from, but it's the den of wolves part isn't because you're studying physics. It's because of everything else there. And I hate to put it this way, but both Christian organizations and scientific organizations, and I'm talking on the popular level, I don't mean, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science and the National Science Foundation. I mean, like, the I effing Love Science Facebook group. Makes a lot of money off of encouraging the conflict thesis. That if I can make people mad, then they'll give me money. And that means if I can make people mad, whether I am a Christian or whether I am a skeptic. If I can make people mad, it brings in the cash. So that's kind of some of the reasons why I think it persists, despite the fact that it's pretty bad history. That's all the talking at you I'm going to do today. Next week, I think it gets kind of interesting. We're going to discuss what is science. I'll give you the spoiler alert. No one's exactly sure what science is. But we'll at least find some things that it's not. Questions, comments, opinions, reactions. This is your big chance.
Do you have access to these slides?
I can, do you have access to the slides? I can, the short answer should be yes. I'm just deciding how. I tell you what I will do. I'm going to be emailing you your homework, hopefully in the next 2 days. I will just attach it to the email, and if you want it, it's there. If you don't want it, then obviously you don't have to open it. But if you want it, it's there. So along with all the notes that I took on it, which has more detail than you could ever want. Any other thoughts or opinions? Oh, yes.
For some of us that may not be able to attend all the sessions, is there a possibility to get to go to watch the video?
Is there a possibility to watch the video? We're hoping so. Caleb back there and I are working together, it's mostly Caleb, to make that possible. My own experience with this sort of thing is that a huge amount of it depends on quality, not on content. So in other words, we're not doing TED Talks up here. It's not going to be that level of quality, but I'm hoping it's not sort of a head off in the distance going, and you're trying to like do this at the video either. So as long as we can hit some middle ground between those, they will be available too. I'm probably just going to upload them to like, a YouTube channel. But yeah, but I will, as that occurs, I will stick it in the email to you. Would somebody like to close us in prayer? It can be short. Dave will do it.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this, all the work that Tom has put into presenting this information, Lord, and we thank you, Lord, that you are a God of the mind, that you haven't left us with just blind faith, that we have reasons to believe, and help us, Lord, to practice those reasons, Father. And we just give you thanks, Lord, and protect us all in the drive home, and bring us back next week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.